right, great. Welcome. Thank you all for attending today. So today's presentation is So You Want to Change Library Types. And myself and our three panelists today have all done that successfully, I'm going to say. So just to get us started, I'm Sabrina Davis. I'm the chair of PEGA-SIS this year. I've worked in academic, firm, county, and court law libraries. And I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves. And Meg, you're first on my screen.
Okay. My name is Meg Cribble. I'm currently Research and Knowledge Manager at Skadden Arps in Boston. And before that, I spent 12 years in academic law libraries.
Great, thank you. Andrew.
Hi, everyone. I'm the Assistant Director for Public Services at the Jacob Burns Law Library at George Washington University Law School. I joined GW last year. Before that, I was in government law libraries at the Law Library of Congress and the Congressional Research Service. And I'd also twice before switched, once from an academic and before that to a federal library as well. So I've got experience in both of those areas.
Thanks. Melissa.
I'm Melissa Bernstein. I work for Third Circuit Court of Appeals. I'm the circuit librarian there now, having started here last May. Before that, I was in academia for almost 16 years. And before that, I practiced law. So at firms, I should say. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Please, audience members, feel free to enter into chat. It should be enabled. Any questions you have for our panelists today? We do have some talking points to get us started, but we'd love to hear from you as well. So just to get us, our first question deals with how to decide about changing library types. So whether moving to a different type of library will advance your career goals or personal goals, just figuring out whether making a switch is a good move for you. And Andrew, since you proposed this question, I'm going to let you start.
Okay, well, thank you. I suppose that for myself, there were kind of two main factors when considering switching library types, and one is practical and one is maybe more philosophical or personal. And the practical aspect of it is geography. Depending upon the type of market you're in, you may find your options are finite in terms of the number of law libraries that are available to you. If you're sort of committed to a particular geographic area and you want your career to have a certain trajectory, then you will probably need to be open to considering other library types. If you have the geographic flexibility, then maybe you can be more focused on one special or one particular library type, if that's your interest. The second reason for me about considering switching library types was thinking about what type of library was more aligned with my my personality and my professional goals and values. I'd had the experience of working in a federal law library for about 8 years. Before that, I had some academic experience, and so I was able to compare the two environments. And when I did, I felt that a law school environment was a little more congenial to my personality type and also to my preferred professional environment. It's the mission of an academic law library is one that really attracted me. And so that was the other main factor in when I thought about switching library types. But I think everybody's different, and people will weigh the factors differently. And I'm sure my co-panelists have sort of their own take on what the relevant factors are.
Thank you. Michelle confirmed you just sent it just to the host and panelists. We already have our first question. So I don't know, Meg and Melissa, did you have anything to add to Andrew, or do you want to get to our first question?
I guess I can add my very short version of this, which is I wasn't super looking, but I'd always been curious about firms since it was a law firm tour during library school that got me curious about law librarianship. But I got into academia without a JD and worked there for many years. And, you know, things are better now, I think, than they were, but it's harder to move up in academia without a JD, and there's a lot more mobility in firms. So that was a draw for me there.
Okay. Melissa, did you have anything to add? You're muted. You know, okay. Okay, I think she's having some technical difficulties. Hopefully she'll be right back. The question we got was about moving from the actual transition from, like, say, for example, a firm to academia, when they seem to want certain experiences that you may not have. So how would a person approach that in their application?
I can give that a shot. I think that you're going to need to be prepared to explore a lot of different opportunities in terms of applying to positions and doing a little bit of networking and reconnaissance to learn what different environments are like. I actually, you know, when I was thinking about making the move from a government law library to an academic law library, I had that same question, you know, is my experience going to be, you know, viewed favorably, or at least kind of comparably to academia? And the law school where I joined is very interested in having faculty, and I think also staff, who have experience in the federal government due to its location. So I don't know that that really played a tremendous role, but I think that it definitely didn't hurt. So the particular workplace you're applying to might have reasons for valuing your experience differently than others. The other aspect of that is, I think that it would be good, if you are thinking about making a switch and applying to a different law library type, to go through your own resume and look at your experience and think about how you can kind of sell that to a potential employer, in the sense of, you know, pointing out what's really valuable. You know, what do you bring to the table, perhaps, that somebody who doesn't have experience in your library type cannot. You know, if you're in a law firm environment, you have experience dealing a lot with pressure, with deadlines, with delivering results, with, you know, maybe dealing with a wider variety of questions. So think about how you can kind of highlight the strengths of your experience to a different potential employer.
Melissa, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I was able to unmute, so I'm just getting quiet.
Okay. Meg?
So I actually had sort of the opposite experience, where there were questions during my interviews with the firm about whether I could handle high pressure and demanding individuals. So I actually ended up reaching back to an experience so old that I don't even keep it on my resume, where just after college I was executive assistant to a high-level executive, and, you know, there was a lot of pressure there. So I was able to talk about that. So really anything in your experience that you can analogize to may be helpful.
The other thing I would say is academic law libraries, the responsibilities of librarians differ a lot. Some are teaching law librarians, in which case they probably want you to have some experience, but a lot the librarians don't teach at all. So you may want to just expand your search and make sure you're really looking at the responsibilities of individual jobs to see what most aligns with what you can bring to the table.
And actually, if pipe in here, that is a you'll get no matter what type of library you're switching from, because I had the opposite, right? I was coming from academia into the courts and had questions about that experience, right? And a lot of it was just explaining how a lot of the day-to-day of what we do as librarians is similar, dealing with budgets, right? Certainly at least at the director level, right? And so you're just making those analogies about how, how it is still relevant.
Let's see. I'm just checking chat real quick. Okay. And then that actually leads nicely into our next talking point, which is differences in responsibilities, the type of work the patrons served, and the different types of law libraries. And I think that factors into your decision of what type of law library you think you want to be moving towards. Does anyone want to start with that? So let's talk about patrons served.
I can talk about that. So, I mean, for me, one of the things that I really like about my job is I get to see what happens beyond law school after working with 1Ls and 3Ls and LLMs for years, like seeing summer associates and new associates all the way to very senior partners. That's been great. I would say the major difference in the jobs is there are fewer long-term research projects. Nearly everything is a much faster turnaround, a much faster thank you, which is nice. You're not waiting months for the article to come out and like see your thank you in the footnote. So I really like that. Actually, I don't have things hanging over me as much, which is nice.
Okay, Andrew. Anything to add about the differences and responsibilities and patron types and all that?
Well, certainly from my own experience, there were some contrasts in patron types at the Law Library of Congress. We served a very broad range of patrons, that went from members of Congress and their staffs to other federal agencies and the U.S. Supreme Court, academics, and a lot of individual researchers who are researching their own legal matters or conducting their own legal research of interest. So very broad spectrum of requests with, very different sort of timing parameters attached to them. If you've got a request from a congressional office, it's addressed immediately, of course. So I would say there, we definitely got the quicker appreciation that Meg mentioned. You can get immediate feedback on the work product that you deliver, and there are some other differences, but we can talk about the other categories as well, perhaps in a bit.
Mm-hmm. Melissa, anything to add right now?
I'd say like Meg, having been in law schools for so long, now I'm on the side where the law is actually made and interpreted, right? Which is, and that's the piece that was missing, right? I was at firms. I was also in academia. So not to minimize, but my work really matters now, right? In that way. Patrons are very different. It's mainly the court, the judges, law clerks, staff attorneys. Occasionally there's other court staff. We are open to the public, but we get very few public patrons here, as you would imagine. We don't have any public computers, and we don't have a pro se collection or anything like that. So we really don't get very many members of the public. We also do order all of the materials that judges have in their chambers. So that is another, now having been on the side of like teaching, I really get to see what people are using, right? Because we get materials for the judges and stuff. So, so it's different, and I am enjoying the change.
That what Meg said and Melissa said kind of triggered something else, going back to the question about if you're trying to move from firm to academic. You said the selling point, you see what the associates didn't learn in law school. And so not that it wasn't taught, but they didn't quite grasp it. And so emphasize that and say, I see these deficiencies. This is what I could do to rectify it, kind of thing. Okay. So what about going back to where you started or moving back and forth between law library types? It's permissible, right? Right. So this is where I want Andrew to talk about going back and forth and also about not burning bridges.
Sure. Well, I guess I moved in both directions a couple of times now. I got my law library start in a practicum at the University of Richmond's Muse Law Library. And from there, I went to a temporary position at the Congressional Research Service, which is part of the Library of Congress. And just reflecting back on the previous question for a moment, that was kind of an interesting government law library environment that's structured almost like a law firm in the sense that you're working with attorneys and congressional staff, and you're treating them as your clients. After CRS, I went back to the University of Richmond as a research and instructional services librarian for a couple of years, and then I went to the Law Library of Congress, and am now moved again back to academia, and in that environment. So I've made the transition multiple times. It's definitely doable. And I would just echo the point about not burning your bridges. The people say frequently about what a small world the law library world is, and it's even smaller if you're kind of focused on a particular geographic area. You'll see the same people move into different settings. You'll see people with whom you interviewed, perhaps, they'll become your supervisor, perhaps you'll become their supervisor. So you can see how it's important to maintain good relationships every step of the way. And you should probably never say never in terms of potentially moving back to an environment, and not tell people, give people a piece of your mind on the way out of any one particular setting.
And I do think, though, that with any of this, I think you need to be cautious about jumping too much. I don't care where you're jumping from, because that does raise, as someone who hires, it raises flags on a resume. If I notice that someone is jumping around too much, you wonder about, their longevity. So.
Meg, anything to add along those lines?
I've only gone one direction, so I don't have anything to add. Just
okay. So talking about moving back and forth, and we talked about how there are similarities and responsibilities across all librarianship. How long would you say it took you to settle into your new jobs in a different type of law library? Meg, you can go first on that one.
Okay. I would say to the point where I was really loving it, around 18 months. About the first year, I was like, oh, I don't know. I think I'm going to go back to academia. And then after a year, I started feeling comfortable. And then after, like I said, 18 months, I was loving it and very happy where I am still.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Melissa or Andrew, we do have another question, but I'm going to give you a chance to share thoughts on settling into new jobs.
I'll let you know. I started here in May. It hasn't even yet. And I will say that one thing I've learned coming to the courts, people stay here for a very, very long time. I have people that have been here 30 years, 40 years, it's so I'm still a newbie. I'll have to let you know.
Okay.
I would say, probably 6 to 12 months to get mostly settled in a new position. Although I will definitely echo Melissa's point about when you go into government service, the settling in period can take longer because people do tend to work in those positions for such a long time, and it can take a little bit more time for you to become aware of all the relationships and kind of work to integrate yourself into those relationships. But yeah, I would say probably about a year to feel like you're fully up to speed.
The newest question we have is, let's see. How long should you stay in one position to not seem like you're not jumping around too much? And I'm going to let Melissa give her take on that, and then I'll probably have a very different take. and Andrew and Meg, if you have suggestions, please let me know. Go ahead, Melissa.
I don't think there's a hard and fast rule for that one, unfortunately. It really is going to depend on personal situations. I can see reasons why someone within a year, there's some sort of life circumstance that happens and you need to move, right, to another location. So I think that can absolutely happen. Or honestly, if you're really unhappy somewhere, I don't believe in like having to just grin and bear it so you don't have a gap on your resume or whatever. Just think it's something to be aware of if that is your pattern, right? If you sort of look at, if there are things that you can't explain, or maybe if it's a cover letter, right? And you have a lot of jumps, maybe you want to explain something, right? Just because without any explanation, if there is too much of that, it can raise some concern. Sorry, that was not.
No, that's fine. And actually, I don't have a different take. I would agree with that. I would just say I am what some would consider a job hopper. So I move every few years. Hopefully I'm in a good place now that I'll be here for a long time. But it is going to vary. Like some places will see that as a concern. Other times they may just say, oh, you're looking for your right fit. I hope this is it, kind of thing. So but like Melissa said, there's not a hard and fast rule.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, and definitely with the point about not staying in a bad situation. If you really do need to make a move, you've got to kind of do what's best for yourself, even if it means leaving a new position relatively quickly. But in the absence of an unusual circumstance like that, my instinct has always been, at least about 2 years in a position, in the absence of unusual circumstances that you can explain before moving on to another position. Because for the employer, there is a lot of, there's a lot of investment in bringing somebody new on and getting them up to speed and all that.
Academia, there is definitely jumping around because in most places, in order to move up, you got to move out, right? Because unless somebody above keeps, which a lot of times doesn't happen. So academia is kind of its own animal in that.
Speaking of academia, we had a question that's kind of outside the scope of this, but and the question was, is a law degree required for academic positions? And I think we're all on the same page that in most cases it is, but I think somebody, Andrew, did you say you didn't have one, or am I making that up?
That was me.
That was Meg. Okay.
Yeah, I do. I don't have one. I just got very lucky in my first job, got very lucky in the second job that I applied to that it didn't matter so much. There was more of an outreach focus along with the reference librarian job, although I did do lots of reference and lots of teaching. So you can find them, but they're fewer and farther between in academia in the U.S.
Yeah, and I will say, though, I still have my ear to the ground a little bit in terms of like the academic world. And I know that's something they are debating because they've had a very hard time there have been a lot of openings and not as many candidates, I believe, in academia. And so that's one of the questions is, do they really need dual degrees? They're looking at credentialing and that sort of thing. So that could be changing.
I just add there could be positions in an academic law library that, that aren't necessarily what you might think of first, but that are still very central to its work, particularly on the technology side. If you've got strong experience in the technology area, there are going to be positions that would value that highly and not require a JD.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say it's mostly reference teaching positions that they're really looking for the JD. There's a lot of tech services positions where it wouldn't be as important, things like that. And if you're looking outside of academia, from my experience, a lot of firms and government jobs do not require the JD. What they're more interested in is relevant experience. Anybody have a different take on that? Okay, go ahead, Melissa.
Confirm that here in the courts of all my librarians, I am the only one with a law degree. So it is definitely not required in the courts anyway.
Okay. We have a very specific question that I don't know that any of us have the expertise to address, but they're asking about in what situations a Canadian law librarian would be considered for a job in the US.
Just off the top of my head, I think they would need to have and be able to demonstrate a thorough understanding of the US legal system, right? This is for, was this for academia or just in general?
Just in general.
I'm imagining for any job that's going to be important. Oh, I see academia.
Yeah, academia. Okay.
Yeah, I think that is going to be very important because that's a lot of what they're teaching. I think it could be really helpful for like a foreign and international law librarian, right? Especially with another country's knowledge of another country's legal system. But I don't think you can't get away from knowing ours.
Okay. All right. Okay. So our next round of talking points questions relate to resources y'all used when you decided to make the leap to a different library type. And I'm going to start with Meg on this one.
Okay, so how much time do we have? I used a lot. I used a lot of things. The very first thing I did was call on some law firm librarians that I knew when I was interviewing, just to find out, like, how is the interview going to be different? So I did that. I didn't know anybody at the time at the firm that I was interviewing. So I did ask a little bit around about that. The other thing I did was look up some of them in the IALL directory. And one of the things that was encouraging to me is, even though I didn't know them, that sort of what Andrew and Melissa had said about government libraries, people were there a very long time. I have colleagues who've been there 20, 30, 40 years, and I took that as a good sign. I also, let me see, what were the other things? The salary survey, I saw we have a comment, a question in the comments about pay disparity. In my experience and what I've heard from other people, the pay does tend to be better in firms than academia. I don't want to say a percentage or an amount because I think it varies by geography, but the salary survey can be helpful for you there and seeing what comparisons are geographically. I looked at webinars about topics presented by firm librarians. I read articles. I also did a fair amount of research on just change generally because I was trying to decide between making this big leap to a firm versus potentially staying in my academic job with a slight change to it. And all the research I did on change indicated that making the bigger change tends to be more satisfying to people in the long term, in case anyone was wondering the outcome of that. And I'll let other people talk about this now because I could go on forever.
Thanks. Andrew?
I'll echo all of that. One thing that can also be useful is looking at job postings, even if you're not necessarily looking to make a move yet, just to start familiarizing yourself with descriptions of the different positions. I think what Meg talked about all the good ones, so now I'm trying to kind of cast my mind out to some other possible sources. You might just think about who you view as role models in the profession, who you admire. Are there people when you go to conferences, you meet professionally, say, I really like to be like that person. I'd really like my career to be like that person's. And, it turns out they all work in a particular type of library, and they have similar positions. That can be kind of a clue about what you gravitate to. But I'll let Melissa chime in as well.
Melissa, you're muted.
Okay, sorry, I'm doing this on my phone, which is not typical. For me, I didn't really have a destination at first. I just knew I needed out of where I was. And so when the idea was sort of suggested, the most helpful thing I did was speak to people that had made the exact switch that I was thinking of, right? They had gone from academia to the court library, specifically the Court of Appeals. I had been directed to at least 2 people who had done that, and I didn't really know either of them, but I reached out to them and they were more than happy to talk with me about it. And then I just talked to other people that had worked, and then in trying to prepare and understand what kind of things they might ask me in the interview, I did speak to those people again. But then there were some more specifics about my court that I was trying to find out. So I did some research, basically networking with anyone I could. I had friends that used to, clerk for federal judges and that sort of thing. So for me, the most helpful thing was the networking. And one thing I think that if you can find someone who used to work, this is like the golden ticket, like especially for me in academia. People move around a lot. And if you could find someone who used to work where you are thinking of going, that can be really helpful because people may be more candid with you about things that you might want to know before you get there that someone who is currently in an environment may not be able to share.
Yeah, I would highly encourage you to do that that last part, because that is sometimes you might just get bitterness, but there will be insight in there as well. Going back to the question about the pay disparity, thanks, Meg, for pointing that one out. I missed it. The question is there a large pay disparity between what you make or made at an academic or public law library compared to a law firm library? Any idea of the percentage difference? I would reinforce the suggestion about the AALL salary survey. But in my experience, I've found more differences like from firm to firm than I have between firm and government and firm and academic. They're not all created equal. So, and that's a thing. That's a good question to raise. I think if, the disclosure of salary on the job description or job announcement and stuff like that, and when you bring it up during the interview and that kind of thing. So with federal, they kind of make it easy because you're required to list your previous salaries. So they kind of have an idea where you're coming from. But that, again, varies.
In government, there are very standard pay tables. It's much more straightforward. It's laid out. I've seen them. What the increases are going to be. We get a government increase every year, or at least did knock wood here. I that in academia, from my experience, budgets are tough anywhere. And so increases, a lot of times you got to kind of fight for them. So for me, it's much more straightforward and prescribed in was the real uncertainty of if you're going to get more. And if so, how much and when?
And there is a difference in academia between public and private institutions as well. So that's just another factor to consider.
I was going to mention that.
Okay,
for
go ahead.
public universities, you can often look up exact salaries by position. For private universities, though, sometimes you can find their salary grade ranges online, depending on the university, so that can give you some guidance as well.
Mm-hmm.
One caution with the public universities, as someone who worked at one, who worked at two, in fact, what they reflect in there includes benefits, and so may not be what you are taking home in salary, right? I looked much more impressive when they included, other things that I didn't actually get paid for.
Okay, I don't see any more pressing questions in the chat. What about, I am going to make a plug. Christine, can you go ahead and put in the chat the link? Tomorrow, PEGA-SIS and the All-SIS Jedi Committee is hosting an interviewing skills roundtable. We're going to have breakout rooms, one for interviewing with academic law libraries, one for firm, one for government, one on tips if this is your law librarianship is your first profession, one for if you're not your first profession, and then an authenticity and interviewing. And so I think Christine put that link in the chat. Its registration is still available, and it'll be at noon Central tomorrow. We are getting a couple more questions. Let's see. Can you speak a bit about opportunities for growth in your positions and also how librarians are treated and viewed in various settings?
I'll speak about the second half of that, because one of the questions I asked all my firm friends before I interviewed with my firm was like, how do the attorneys really treat you? Because one has heard horror stories, and they all said that they had never had a bad experience with an attorney. They got so much respect for their specialized skills and knowledge. And I was still skeptical, but it's all true. At least in my firm and my office, I feel very valued and appreciated. I know that there have been screamers in the past, like olden days. I know some of the retired partners who may have been, but that doesn't happen anymore. So hopefully that's true more widely as well.
Yeah, and I can echo the treatment piece. Here, certainly, I get feedback all the time on how valued my librarians are. They get it directly. I hear it as well. So I know in the courts, both from clerks and from the judges themselves, they really appreciate it. In terms of opportunities for growth, I can say in the courts, it is different. There are a lot of things a lot of programs that are offered specifically by like the Federal Judicial Center has a lot of programs and things, but they're not necessarily directed at librarians per se. I know that one of the things which I discovered becoming a court librarian is that they do not pay for memberships in professional organizations, period. So I pay personally for AALL. I usually cannot afford to send someone to AALL. And so the courts do their own, every 2 years, they have their own court library conference that they put on in Washington, D.C. That being said, there are some other opportunities that people can search out. And unfortunately, it very much depends for us on a budget year as to how much I can afford to send people places.
Okay. What? Go ahead.
I was just going to kind of chime in on and echo those observations. In academia, it seems like there's often more of a budget for professional development in the form of memberships and conferences. I also had the experience in a federal role of not having any professional memberships paid for, and that was just something that I think you have to accept it with the position. I also paid out of pocket for my AALL and my other memberships. was still able to attend AALL some years, depending on whether I was involved in a committee. Others got to attend when they were presenting, so that there can still be opportunities for participation depending on your organization. If you're in a government law library, there might be opportunities for professional development that aren't necessarily library specific, or specific to your particular department. At the Library of Congress, there was a leadership development program, and they have other supervisory development programs and other programs that you wouldn't necessarily find in an academic setting or probably a firm setting. So I think it can just vary from setting to setting.
Okay, we have 3 minutes left and 2 questions. So, what are the intangible or non-traditional benefits offered by the different types of libraries? Any takers?
I can kick it off maybe a little bit, at least comparing academia and government. If you're at a big federal library, there's a certain sense of, officialness, if that's your thing. At the Law Library of Congress, you were interfacing with government offices and their staff. You would get sort of VIP visitors from other countries' governments sometimes. So that could be neat. Academia, the big tangible is participating in the development of legal scholarship and helping, lawyers to be, kind of grow and develop, which can also be nice to see.
I would agree with what Andrew said, but the other piece that I would say, at least in my experience, is that I honestly feel like in the courts, you're being pulled less in 50 different directions, which is something that I absolutely noticed in academia. There's just not enough hours in the day for what they would want us to be doing. So that is nice. It feels a little less stressful.
I agree with Melissa on that. I actually feel far less stressed about work generally at the firm than I did in academia, when there were always way too many things that, there was just not enough time in the world for everything we wanted to do.
Okay. Our last question. Do you think changing library types is as difficult or achievable as moving into or out of law libraries entirely? And I've done that, so I can speak to it, but I'm going to let y'all, if you have any thoughts first.
This really is my first move, and it was at a pretty high level, right? It's at the director level. And so for me, I really just had to be selling how the difference wasn't so, I was still doing a lot of the same stuff. So I don't think my experience is as helpful as, for instance, here.
Andrew or Meg?
I would just really be speculating. I would think that it's probably easier to move within the profession of law librarianship than outside it. But to Melissa's point, at a certain level, you're sort of, selling your leadership skills, perhaps more than anything else.
I would say one of the things that intrigued me most about the posting for my current job is how similar many of the tasks listed were, instructing attorneys and doing some outreach and, reference. And that the big change for me was learning all of the business databases that I use. So I think it's very doable. I think if you've got, if you're a smart librarian and you know how to learn databases on the fly and, technology things on the fly, all those things that we all do, it really is quite achievable. Sometimes I think the hardest part is just convincing the folks at your new job that you've got the skills and those things we talked about earlier at the beginning about analogizing.
Great. Melissa?
I was just going to say, just thinking off the top of my head, I apologize. This is only my opinion here, but I do think that the hardest switch to sell is probably if you have been a firm librarian like your whole life and want to go to academia. I think that's going to be the hardest sell because you have a lot of people in academia who have just gone up the ranks in academia, and you just got to do some educating. Maybe it will get better. I see someone is agreeing. I just think that their own, I'm going to use the word prejudice just for shorthand, but because of their own sort of prejudice and formed ideas of what is involved, I think it's that's going to be the most challenging.
Okay. Thank y'all so much. We are 1 minute over, but if there's any last minute questions, I can hang on. I don't know if our panelists have time for just a minute to see if there's more questions. Okay. Let's see. I'm not seeing anything. So this webinar was recorded. If you know someone who missed it and wanted to attend it, it will be posted to the PEGA-SIS YouTube page within a day or so. Look for that announcement. And again, if you're in the process of switching career or library types, I do encourage you to check out our interviewing skills roundtable tomorrow. Thank you all so much for joining us today.
I suspect the same is true of all the panelists, but I'm happy to speak to anyone directly if they want to, or any form or whatever.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Right, great. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Christine.